Hello everyone, this is AndresRestart, and we just learned about some pretty big deal things regarding the Metroid Prime series. We have teases for the future of the series, presumably Metroid Prime 5. We have questions answered regarding mysterious events in the game, and also divisive design choices explained as well. But also Kensuke Tanabe, the Metroid Prime series producer, has announced officially his retirement from Nintendo. So we have a lot to get into today. So this interview was conducted by Nintendo Dream magazine with key members of the Metroid Prime 4 team. Kensuke Tanabe, a senior game producer at Nintendo, Bill Vandervoot, the senior game design director at Retro Studios, and Takeshi Yamamoto, a senior game music and sound designer at Nintendo. Now keep in mind this is a translation, so some words may seem a little weird or off. I'll try to read through this as well as possible. I'm going to focus on some significant points in this interview that I think are best for discussion here, but there are other interesting parts in this interview about just the designs of the game, what went into music development, how they went about creating and crafting certain areas of the game. So if you're interested in that stuff, things that they did really well with Metroid Prime 4, this interview will be linked in the description below so you can read through the entire interview. But let's start here. How was the new motorcycle Viola created? Tanabe, around 2016, when I started the project, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild had just adopted an open world format and received high praise. So I just want to say, right here with this first line, there's an extremely interesting nugget. The fact that development started in 2016. We were not sure how far into development Metroid Prime 4 was when they had announced it in summer of 2017, or when they had announced the restart in early 2019. But now we know, from this interview, they started in 2016, so they already had been a few years into development when the restart had to be announced. Continuing though, at the same time, I often saw comments online like, I really want to play an open world game like Metroid. However, the characteristic of games like Metroid is that you gradually expand your range of movement after gaining abilities, while the mechanism of an open world is being able to move freely in a vast area from the beginning. So the two are actually contradictory. So right here, Tanabe is explaining that to create an open world game wouldn't really be a proper Metroid game the way he envisions it, which is the way most Metroid fans envision the series. But continuing here, even so, I still thought, perhaps limiting the scope to a specific area could address this expectation to some extent. Also, I felt that being able to ride a motorcycle freely within that area would add a sense of rhythm and variation to the constantly tense and oppressive gameplay of Metroid. However, when I later saw Link riding a motorcycle in the Breath of the Wild DLC, I momentarily thought, wow, will people think we're copying this? I hesitated for a moment, but then I immediately thought, no, we're not copying, and Samus riding a motorcycle would definitely look incredibly cool, so I stopped hesitating and decided to create the motorcycle. And I think that's enough to read through for this particular section here. What's really a big deal about this is that we are learning not only did the initial development of the project begin in 2016, but the choice of having an open area to explore was by Kensuke Tanabe, the Prime series producer, from before the restart, and it was also his idea to introduce Viola, the motorcycle, and I agree, it is very cool, but he was responsible for these choices. And while I did enjoy these choices, many people have judged these choices very negatively and have blamed Retro Studios for these choices, but Tanabe is a separate entity from Retro Studios, and these choices were already made before Retro Studios came into the fold in 2019. Now, personally, I think these choices aren't inherently wrong choices. I think they were fun, good choices. They were choices I actually predicted, by the way, because I thought this was actually a good direction to go, but maybe the execution could have been done a bit differently, and that, I would say, the entire team is responsible for, but also I'm not going to go so far as to say that Metroid Prime 4 is a failure. By no stretch of the imagination, in my opinion. I think it's actually a pretty good game. It's my favorite game of 2025, but there is room for improvement, and I think Retro Studios is going to take the feedback and build upon this latest entry in the series. Anyways, moving on to what Tanabe said here, because I think what he says is actually a very big deal. When we decided that the setting this time was a planet in another dimension, and further set up that Samus would gain telekinesis there, it was natural to assume that the inhabitants of Viros would develop a culture around telekinesis. However, before we got to that point, the fact that they had experienced a mechanical civilization and invented Viola was already a given, because the initial idea was to let players ride motorcycles, so this setting had to be true. So this part's just interesting because Tanabe already had in mind that he wanted Samus riding around on a motorcycle in an open space, and so this in turn impacts the decisions surrounding the lore and characters of the world. Skipping ahead a little bit, Chatoyant Valoon and 12 members of the Lemorn race, following a prophecy, were transported to various planets across the multiverse in search of the Chosen One, carrying small teleportation stations for their return. However, they never found the Chosen One, and ultimately decayed and perished wherever they arrived. This, however, means that 11 other teleportation stations still exist. While it will be difficult to create separate stories for all of them, I believe that it at least leaves room for the possibility of creating some of these stories in the future. So this is actually huge, and this goes back to my ending explained video where I did talk about how in the game they talk about these different priests that went out in search of the Chosen One. Now, there were 12 priests that went out there. Here, though, they reference 11. That would be because we actually already saw one of the teleporters. That was the one that led to Viros from the planet Tanamar. So here, they are saying there are 11 others like the one we found on Tanamar. But this is a big deal because we've already heard that they chose to have Metroid Prime 4 take place in a different space and time. That way, the events of the game wouldn't really get in the way of the Metroid timeline. So they don't want to ignore the Metroid timeline in terms of retconning it or doing things that don't fit. But in order to have creative freedom with the choices they want to make, they have set this up so there are potential future games as well where they can just go to a different space and time. And so here they're not only teasing a significant future for the Metroid Prime series where there can be multiple sequels to Metroid Prime 4, but that each game is going to tie into the Lemorn now moving forward, taking place in their own space and time. That way they don't have to be held back by the constraints of the Metroid timeline. But there is more than just this that teases Metroid Prime 5. We'll get to that. Tanabe, when we were making Metroid Prime Hunters, the game designers at development company NST created complex backstories for all the hunters who appeared. One of these was the setting that Sylux harbored resentment towards Samus and the Galactic Federation. At that time, I wanted to further expand the Metroid Prime universe and create various spin-offs in the future. So, although I felt he might already have his own set of settings, I still asked them to not finalize the details yet. While I was planting a foreshadowing in Metroid Prime 3 and the 100% ending of Metroid Prime Federation Force, I kept thinking, someday I'll make a game about Samus and Sylux. After that, a long time passed before I finally had the opportunity to make this game. Considering my age, I felt making this Metroid Prime might be my last chance. Therefore, I conceived and planned this project as the first installment of the Sylux saga. Literally right there, the first installment of the Sylux saga, when we already account for how Tanabe talked about how there are 11 other teleporters out there for future games, and now how this is only the first installment of the Sylux saga, strongly suggesting there's still a lot more to learn about Sylux, as we talked about in the ending explained video. These are some very strong hints that there are plans for a future Metroid Prime game. But continuing, I portrayed Sylux as a villain with a dark personality, deep resentment, and despicable methods. And from this game onward, Samus will realize that a direct confrontation with him is inevitable, and he must be completely defeated. Therefore, the final battle between Sylux and Samus is not yet over. However, it took longer than I had imagined to complete the game. So again, he's saying the story's not over, there is more. But also, yeah, Metroid Prime 4 took a very long time. Now, as Tanabe referenced here, he has to retire. So he has to leave the future up to others, as he says here. Furthermore, I have confirmed that I will no longer be able to participate in the production of the series. Whether a sequel will be made is still uncertain, but I sincerely hope that one day, Miss Tabata and Retro Studios will be able to tell the story completely and bring it to a close. So at this point, Tanabe is stepping away from the Metroid Prime series. He's been responsible for producing this series over the many years, but now there will be different leadership responsible for the direction of the Metroid Prime games, but Tanabe made sure to set the stage for the future by putting out these teleporters from the Lemorne and putting out the first installment of the Sylux saga. However, I'll also say that a sequel is still uncertain. That part is said. They are not confirming Metroid Prime 5, but it has been strongly hinted at here quite clearly. I mean, we consider the way Metroid Prime 4 ended, without going into specifics for those who are trying to avoid spoilers if you haven't finished the game yet. It's clear that it's a little bit of a cliffhanger, which certainly leads you to think that, yeah, there's gotta be more. But this next part is probably going to surprise some people, what Tanabe said here. Ultimately, I hadn't initially planned to write the scanned text myself. Previously, Retro Studios staff handled the in-game text, but that staff member was no longer with Retro Studios. Let's keep in mind that this is Retro Studios many years after the initial Metroid Prime games. While we did hear from Video Games Chronicle that half of the Metroid Prime 3 team was still with Retro Studios when they started Metroid Prime 4 when it was announced back in 2019, the restart, there were still a lot of key members that were no longer around when the restart began. Continuing here, therefore, we decided to outsource to a professional writer. However, writers are experts in writing and naturally prioritize producing good, clever, and beautiful articles. As a result, it was difficult to create text that served the gameplay we needed. Furthermore, ensuring the recipient fully understood the same specifications was also challenging. Continuing like this would fall short of the delivery deadline, so I decided to write it myself. Frankly, being rushed by work, I made some mistakes during the adjustments phase. Although the writing process was enjoyable, it shouldn't have been my responsibility. So Tanabe took on the job to write the log entries in Metroid Prime 4. They initially decided to outsource to a professional writer, but if you were paying attention, they had to move away from that writer because of the communication issues and understanding that writer would have in terms of the context of gameplay. And it's also mentioned there were deadline constraints. They had a deadline that they made sure to hit with this game, suggesting there was a little bit of a rush here. So this is actually a very interesting situation because we've come to understand Nintendo over the years as a company that will let a game bake until it's fully complete, right? They are not afraid to delay a game if it means making sure it's the best it can be. But here we're hearing that they had a deadline and it needed to be met. Now, when we consider that they literally restarted development and they were developing Metroid Prime 4 throughout the entire Switch era, we did wait an extremely long time for Metroid Prime 4. Tanabe himself says the game took a lot longer than expected. It took so long that by the time this game has come out, he now has to retire. And so what I understand here is that I think after a certain point, even though Nintendo may have the philosophy to take their time with games until they are as good as possible, there is a breaking point. The game can only take so long. And I'm sure there's a lot of factors that go into when they ultimately decide a final deadline. Some of that may have to do with the cost of the game. Some of that may have to do with the ridiculously long development time. Some of that may have to do with meeting fan demands because they did announce this game and fans have been waiting for a very long time. Many fans were exhausted with waiting. But also, I wouldn't be surprised if some of it also had to do with making sure Metroid Prime 4 was available within that initial year that the Switch 2 launched, 2025. Notice how it came out at the very end of the year, December. It's almost like they did everything they can to squeeze out the game just in time for 2025. Why would they do that? Perhaps because they look at what they have coming down the road, and they also consider the benefits of having a game out in that first year in terms of sales, and this was a deadline made with all those considerations in mind. So I'm overall left thinking that yes, Nintendo still has this general philosophy of taking their time with their games. They did take their time with Metroid Prime 4, but unfortunately it took so long that they still ultimately were in a bit of a rush at the end there. That seems to be what has been implied by this piece of the interview. But there's still plenty more interesting stuff in this interview here. So this part's from Bill. We have clear goals regarding the plot and characters, and these goals sometimes drive our choices. Now, I just want to say, this is in present tense, it looks like. Now, again, reminder, this is a translation, so something like that could be lost in translation, but when said in this way, assuming it's been translated as intended, this would suggest that Bill's not just talking about the plans they already had, but the plans they have moving forward as well regarding the plot and characters. Continuing though, for example, in most areas of the game, the initial routes are more linear, which is more conducive to telling the story of the area itself and the Federation soldiers within it. We wanted to motivate players using a familiar and narrative-driven approach. Of course, even in areas visited for the first time, there will still be places to revisit and areas to explore, but the structure isn't as intricately interwoven as in the original Metroid Prime. And so here it is acknowledged by Bill, the senior game designer at Retro Studios, that this game isn't intricately interwoven like Metroid Prime, which is a common criticism of Metroid Prime 4. It's talked about how because they wanted to tell the story, they structured a lot of the areas in the game in a very linear fashion on purpose. Now, for those who have paid attention to the trajectory of the Metroid Prime series, a lot of this shouldn't be too surprising, because with each game, they've applied a little bit more of a clear narrative focus. Metroid Prime 2 started to include some cutscenes with other characters. Metroid Prime 3 included significant amounts of voice acting and huge set pieces, taking things to a whole other level. And Metroid Prime 4 has continued with that. And so this does help to explain why Metroid Prime 4 doesn't have a structure that is as intricately interwoven as the original Metroid Prime. But the very fact that Bill mentions that, I do think gives us some room for optimism that they may explore something more intricately interwoven in the future. Fingers crossed. So here we get an explanation as to what actually happened with Sylux at the beginning of the game and throughout the game. Tanabe. Sylux was severely injured during the teleportation and accidentally ended up at the top of the Tower of Time. Samus did blast him pretty hard right before they all teleported. He entered the healing pod there and synchronized with the Tower of Time, Chrono Tower by the way. Through this, he obtained information about Lamorne, learning that to escape from Viros he needed to use the main teleportation station, and activating the station required 5 main teleportation keys. Therefore, he planned to use the Sylux Metroids, these special Metroids, who had been transported with him to control the Key Guardians and seize their keys. However, the Key Guardians' mental power surpassed that of the special Metroids, resulting in both losing their normal thinking and becoming beings filled only with ferocious hostility. Sylux's recovery would take time, during which he would mostly be unconscious, but in his brief moments of lucidity, he would control the cyborgs to attack Samus, attempting to steal the keys Samus had already obtained. It was also during these moments of lucidity that Sylux's consciousness would briefly connect with Samus's consciousness, allowing Samus to see Sylux's memories in a flashback. I think it's interesting that Tanabe talks about Sylux accidentally ending up at the top of the Tower of Time, which just seems like such a weird, odd accident there. In my Ending Explained video, I theorized that Sylux ends up there on purpose. Like, there is reason behind it, actually. It's not just, oh, well, I just coincidentally landed in the most ideal location possible. At least narratively, that wouldn't make that much sense. For this to be a good narrative, there would have to be more reason behind this. Now, trying to read between the lines here, it's been talked about in multiple occasions throughout this interview that there is a desire for a future. There are plannings and a foundation that has already been set for future installments here, and that we've only seen the beginning of the Sylux saga. If there is more to learn here, perhaps Tanabe would not spoil that in this interview, and so would just say something like accidentally, making it to the very top most important place in the entire game. And I'm getting at this because I have theorized that perhaps Sylux had some intent with going to Tanamar. There are some signs of that I do get into in my ending explained video, and there perhaps Samus isn't the only chosen one, which would certainly make things more interesting. Now, that's just theories, but at the very least, Tanabe has said that there is still more to Sylux's story. We do not know it all. Now, this next part may actually help to further illustrate my point, but it may also leave you totally scratching your heads here. Tanabe, actually, I hardly play games. This part just throws me. That's subjective, I'm sure. I watch movies more often. I majored in film production in college, so when designing a game, I don't analyze or study other games. Rather than conceiving the game system itself, I focus more on how to create emotional fluctuations for the player. That's how so many so-called wow moments can be created, and first determine the theme that this work wants to express. So, given this film production history here, you would think Tanabe would have a focus and understanding on a telling of a narrative that wouldn't just have Sylux appearing in the most convenient place possible with no actual apparent reason. Especially when he's already said multiple times that this is the beginning to Sylux's story, there's far more here. So yes, I'm led to believe that there is far more here, otherwise none of these things add up. Continuing though, so this time we started the design of the entire game from this theme. In Metroid Prime 4, I wanted to create a game that would leave players hesitant and conflicted at the very last moment before pressing the A button to end the game. And I actually did something similar with The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening, but this time I wanted to go a step further, to make players feel a sense of bewilderment as they watch the end credits scroll by wondering, huh, is that all? Making it a more memorable game. I anticipated some negative reactions, but personally, I'm more likely to be impressed by movies that leave a lasting impression, like a thorn in my side, than those with happy endings. So this is also a challenge. Could I achieve that in a game? Therefore, I first set the final scenario and then thought about the structure of the entire game. To this end, we set up Federation soldiers who fight alongside Samus and planned gameplay that allows players to gradually deepen their bond with Samus, that is the player, as they progress through the game. We had planned several events that would have deepened our bond, but we had to cut them due to time constraints, which I really regret. So this is a second time in this interview where Tanabe expresses some level of regret or not wanting to have had things happen in the way they did because of time constraints. So Tanabe, the Prime series producer, twice in this interview has kind of explained that the game didn't really happen exactly as he wanted because of, well, not having enough time. Which they had plenty of time, which just kind of goes to show that, yeah, Metroid Prime 4 certainly had its challenges. Not to say it isn't a good game, but definitely there is room for improvement. But even Tanabe also says here he anticipated some negative reactions with the end, and there are a lot of people that, yeah, they're like, huh, is that all? They're certainly confused about that ending. And so this is what Tanabe wanted. This was his vision, and I'm sure people are going to read this or hear about this and be very confused why this is what he wanted to do. But at the end of the day, he's an artist. This was his vision, and I still enjoyed Metroid Prime 4. I did my whole ending explained video. I think there's purpose behind what is done. Maybe it could have been conveyed a little bit better if they weren't as challenged by the amount of time they had, but that's the situation. But I'll read this last piece here from Tanabe. It's been 40 years since I joined Nintendo. This Metroid Prime 4 will be the last game I worked on at Nintendo. However, we didn't deliberately do anything special. Instead, Like all previous Nintendo titles, we worked together with Retro Studios to create it, hoping to bring a fun and unique experience to players of all ages and types. If it becomes a game that leaves a lasting impression on players who have played it, I will be very gratified. And for those who haven't played it yet, I hope you will experience the unknown planet Veros through Samus's eyes. So, this part's also interesting. This is almost kind of like Tanabe's goodbye, and so that's kind of heartfelt. But also, here he talks about how he didn't want to deliberately do anything special with this being his last game at Nintendo. And this goes a little bit against what we've heard, that Metroid Prime 4 is supposed to be kind of like his last big hurrah. Now, personally, I just think this comes down to things being lost in translation. There's also been debates about Metroid Prime 5 already being in development. I think there's wiggle room here with what's been going on, but clearly they've set a foundation. Tanabe is telling us they've set a foundation for Metroid Prime 5. They set a story, they've positioned things. What else has been done is uncertain. But what do you all think? Let me know in the comments below. This is AndresRestart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I will see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.